Welcome to an all-new episode of Get Lit with Lianna, the podcast. Join me as I sit down with a new guest author in each episode to discuss their books, careers, and everything in between. Today I'm sitting down with romance author Bridget Morrissey, who wrote the new LGBTQ romance, That Summer Feeling. I love chatting with Bridget about the genesis of the story, some of her favorite moments to write, and why she felt it was important to share this story now. We also got to talking about the main trope of this book and why it's sometimes a bit controversial, and how she managed to execute it so perfectly. So without further ado, my conversation with Bridget Morrissey starts right now. Welcome, Bridget Morrissey, to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. I actually recently finished reading your new book, That Summer Feeling, because I was like, I do this thing now. I used to not do it, and I'm doing it now, and I'm really loving it, where I'm reading the books of the people I'm chatting to, like right before I speak with them, so that the book is like super at the fresh of like the top of my brain. And it just like is adding this whole other layer of excitement because I'm like totally fangirling since I literally just finished reading your book like 2 days ago. So I'm very excited to have you here, have you on the show. Firstly, how are we feeling now that the book, by the time this is out, the book will be out? So tell me how we're feeling now about being so close to it being in the hands of anybody who wants to read it.
Thank you so much for having me and for being excited and reading. I'm excited to be here. And as for how I'm feeling, it's really strange. Something about this book feels like I don't remember anything about it. I don't remember writing it. I can't believe it's coming out. I'm in some sort of fugue state about it, but I guess a positive one. And I'm excited
so exciting
for other people to get their hands on it. Yeah, but that's where I'm personally at with it.
100%. Okay. I love that so much. So before we talk about this book in particular, I would love to know a little bit more about like your writing journey, your background. I know this is not the first book you've published. So like, tell me a bit about your history being an author and kind of the books you were working on before this one.
Yeah. So this is my 5th novel. It is my 3rd adult romance. And prior to that, I'd written 2 young adult contemporaries that were heavier. And so when I pivoted to romance, I definitely wanted to work on something lighter and to kind of find the joy in writing and also just in general. And so that's how I got on the path of writing adult romance. And when it came time to pitch a book for my option, which is the 3rd book with my editor, I had this idea for adults at summer camp. And I'm a queer person myself, and I really wanted to write a sapphic love story. And so it just seemed like the perfect time to get right into it. And it was kind of a great way to marry all of my interests, which is reconnecting with things from your youth. And so the summer camp setting really lends itself well to that. And then, elevating queer love and talking about it.
I love it. I'm so excited about this book. I can't wait for everyone to read it. It's such an important story and such a story of like self-discovery and just like being kind and giving yourself that space to figure out who you are on your own timeline. But I would love to know more about like the writing process, I guess, behind this book, like the genesis of the story. How did this whole concept come to you? Because I grew up going to summer camp and I have very fond memories of it. And I always say, like, if I were to write a romance, it would be then and now timelines, and my then timeline would be set in summer camp. And I love that your like now timeline is set in summer camp, which is epic. So tell me about like the concept and how it kind of came to you.
Yeah. So actually, funny enough, I've never been to a real sleepaway camp. Okay. I grew up a gymnast, and so I went to a gymnastics sleepaway camp, which is nothing like other sleepaway camps. It was just, I did gymnastics in a different state. So it's not the same, but I guess, in the interest of full transparency, I have been to a type of sleepaway camp.
Okay, fair. We won't judge here.
Yeah, thank you. I've always been fascinated by it, and definitely much like the main character in the book, Garland, like, I think it's really cool. And I always people would come back from camp and they'd be coming back transformed and rejuvenated. And so when I was coming up with the concept for this book, I wish I could remember exactly how the summer camp came to me, but I guess I was just thinking about those ideas of like someone who's kind of at a point where she needs to rebirth in some ways, and she needs growth and she needs change. And that setting lends itself so well to it because it is a place of discovery and it's out of your element. And as adults, we don't get that as often. We don't get opportunities to go be someone else or just like kind of assume a new identity for a week and be separate from your everyday life.
For sure.
And so in creating this, that was where the summer camp came in clutch. But yeah, as for the actual memory of why, it's lost to time. I don't know why anymore. I don't remember.
So like the actual outlining process for the story, like how exactly did that work? Are you someone that like writes in order? Did you write in bits and pieces? Like how was that actual process of putting this story together?
I definitely, the more books I've written, the more attached I am to outlining and how it helps the process along. But I always leave space for discovery for myself. So there's definitely a pretty strong bones. And I would say all of the major beats are outlined ahead of time. But there's a lot of just little granular stuff that gets added in as I go. And sometimes if I have something later in the story that feels like I want to do, and then I'll go backfill early on, like to support it.
Okay.
But there's nothing that I think comes completely out of nowhere to me. Every one of the like major beats I have had the idea of ahead of time.
Right. So from start to finish, I guess, like from the early days of outlining until you handed in your last copy edits to your editor and you're like, I'm done, hands up. It is what it is. How long was that entire process?
This book was really fast, actually.
Wow.
Typically it's a little longer. I think that the initial concept for it was what is time? November of 2021. I had turned in the idea to my agent, and then like copy edits were probably like November of 2022. So we're looking at a year all told from like conception to out to readers, which is fast. And it definitely felt fast, but there was kind of I don't know, that maybe that's part of why I have a hard time remembering some of it, because I just was
like, you blitzed through it.
Yeah, pencils down, going for it. But yeah, I guess a year. It wasn't like this concept was something I had in my back pocket before. I mean, maybe somewhere in my deep subconscious, but nothing consciously.
Okay, fair. So this book is obviously, it's a remarkable story, but it's super, super character driven. And I just found myself being totally like compelled and very, very intrigued by both Garland and Stevie. So what was it like to create those characters? How did you come up with them as individual people and get their voices kind of right?
When I'm creating a romance, I always love to make the characters kind of a springboard for each other. Whatever one character lacks, the other one has, but then also having that Venn diagram crossover of shared interests and shared language and whatever. And so when it came to Garland and Stevie, I think that Garland, the main character, I knew if there was anything I knew about this book early on, it was that I wanted to write somebody who was sort of relentlessly optimistic, and the type of person that was optimistic to the point of getting in her own way, like not being able to accept defeat or disappointment, and then like reaching a point where she had to face it. And so in thinking of like an ideal love interest for her, I wanted her to be exposed to and introduced to someone who was a little more brazen and kind of emotionally direct, but then also still was kind-hearted. Like it's not like a grumpy sunshine type trope or anything. It's like, this is somebody who, you know, has their struggles too, but also chooses the light when she can. So that was my sort of creation for them both and how I approach that.
And then I guess, like, I am just always so curious when I talk with authors who are able to like write two very different characters. Like, how do you kind of decide like whose voice is what? Like, how does the actual character like speak to you or come to you? Is that kind of hard to put on the page?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's hard to put on the page. I think I just hear it in my head and then I'll transcribe it. And then as I'm going through and you're fine tuning, sometimes I'll realize, oh, that's a little bit more of something that one character would say versus the other. So it's not, I don't necessarily get it all right at first, but I think just giving myself the permission to, you know, not get it perfectly. And then in the later stages, when you're not thinking so much about creating the story as a whole, it's easier to go in there and fine tune and tweak and think of like how they would communicate something versus how someone else would.
Fair. That's totally fair. So before we get into some of my favorite moments of the book and like plot questions I have, I would love if you could first provide everyone listening just like a little summary about what That Summer Feeling is about.
Absolutely. So That Summer Feeling is the story of a recently divorced woman who's kind of been in a rut, and her sister asks her to come to an adults only week of a sleepaway camp. And she agrees, hoping that it will be a chance to find rejuvenation and just take a little brain break, basically. And while she's there, she ends up running into a man from her past that she mistakenly thinks she's meant to be with, only to fall head over heels for his sister instead.
It's such a crazy, cute concept. And I feel like it's like one of those concepts that like maybe we've heard before in theory, but it's executed so differently. And I love the play on like different tropes that you use in this book. What were some of your favorites to write? And like, what was the decision behind using them?
Yeah, I think I've realized about myself that a lot of times if I'm employing a trope, I'm almost always trying to find an interesting way to me to like subvert it.
Mm-hmm.
And then with That Summer Feeling, I know that this is like a story of Insta Love because it has to be in some ways, because she's coming to summer camp and this is a completely new setting for her. And what I wanted was a totally new experience. So when it came to the love interest, this is my first time doing strangers to lovers.
Okay.
And it's really hard. And I know that there's just like, just in general, it's hard for people because you don't get to have the immediate intimacy of backstory and being like, oh, when we were this age, we did this, and now here we are. And so you have to build it from the ground up, and then added on to that the time constraint of camp being only a week.
Yeah.
That made it, to me, I like challenges like that. So I guess I went into this one challenging myself and wanting to not rely on the things that I've reached for in the past, which is like second chance, where you can always take a beat when you're like, what's going to happen between them? Well, let me think about what happened in the past and see how I can juxtapose it in the now. So I think that was probably the biggest one I went forward with this book using. And then it is a story of like found family. It's like queer found family. And that's something I'm always reaching for with my books. I just love it. I love the idea of your chosen family. I love the idea of friends that become like family, and how they can kind of fill in the gaps that maybe you didn't have in your own actual biological family.
It's very funny. Like everybody, before I had read this book, obviously I was like hearing chatter about it on social media, and everyone was like, it's Insta Love, but try it, because everyone's always so worried about Insta Love and like how it's going to be executed, and like if it's going to be believable, if you'll be able to be immersed in the story. And like I was so impressed and honestly like pleasantly surprised with how attached I became like to this relationship and to these characters and to the story. And I think it really, like you said, it lends to the setting and it being camp. Like everybody, like growing up, me even being a child at camp, like camp goggles, like it was just like even the most like person you would so not be into, like everything's heightened at camp. So now being an adult and having all these added elements of like her like rediscovering her sexuality and like who she wants to be with, and just all of these added things as an adult and being as a fully formed person, it's so believable that you could fall in love so fast and so intensely. So I loved like that little, almost like a piece of reality in Insta Love when it's kind of an unrealistic kind of trope, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And I mean, all I can say is I did my best and I'm proud of it. And I know that it can definitely be a polarizing trope, but I think in the terms of like how I constructed this story, I'm very you should be like, you really like you hit the ball out of the park with this one. But I would love to talk more now about the sapphic romance storyline part of this book, because obviously it's like the biggest component of the story. Why was it important for you to tell this type of story now in comparison to like your previous books? Yeah, it sort of just became a natural progression for me. In Love Scenes and 1,000 Miles, which are my other two adult romances, they have queer main characters, but they are in a male-female relationship. And when it came to this book, I was just like, I don't want to do that again. I really want to write a sapphic story. And thinking about that and thinking about I'm 33 and a lot of my friends in this like particular kind of like millennial time I came out later in life and myself included. And so when I was looking at how I wanted to approach a queer love story, I really wanted to incorporate that arc into it of somebody that didn't know when they were a child or when they were like a young teen, and instead is figuring it out later, because I have seen it so much in my friends and in myself that I wanted to represent that. And also, just kind of as like a sidebar, I have a lot of friends that have gotten divorced too. And so the main character in That Summer Feeling is divorced. And I guess I just wanted to approach that and be like, hey, this happens. It's okay. Like, get back in there, you know, and also to like just lend a voice to the fact that people can be divorced by 30, you know, and it is a part of life. And in Garland's case, a lot of it had to do with just, you know, not being able to know herself in a real way.
100%. So what was that like, writing that kind of arc of Garland's character in particular, because she has such like a trajectory in terms of discovering herself? Like, what was that like to kind of get into her head and tell her story from her point of view?
I really enjoyed getting to write Garland, and I really like writing sincere characters. And so it was fun to make it the main character, because I think my instinct a lot of times with characters like this that have a compass, like a moral compass, like Garland does, where she just has that like apology instinct. And like, she always is like sort of people pleasing, is that I will kind of shy away from it, or I will try to like juxtapose it with another POV that is somebody that's not that way. And so for this to just be her book, I think was very freeing for me to let her just be the guiding light of the story, and to just let her still be the way that she is, but also learn how to take up space in the world in a more productive way for her. And that is a lesson you can still learn in your 30s, and you don't have to be limited to discovering that when you're young or never learning it at all. I'm so big about that. And so I love to do that in my books of like, you know, I call it second puberty. Like you can come back to a lot of the lessons you learned in your youth or your teens and reevaluate them and go, wait, that's not who I want to be, or I can be a better version of that. So
100%. That's so well said. Looking back at the book as a whole, like what were some of the really more like challenging scenes to write, or one of those scenes where it was like, yeah, like I'm close, but I'm not exactly there. Like, how am I going to fix this or improve this or change this? Like, what were some of the struggles when writing the story that kind of like stumped you along the way?
So Garland has an older sister, Dara, who comes to camp with her, and they have sort of a B plot that's like threaded through the book. And while I was revising, my editor wanted us to sort of like elevate it or amplify it. And so that involved creating some new scenes with them. And there's a thread about cutting Dara's hair that comes through. And for whatever reason, that chapter, which happens quite late in the book, was, I think, the last thing I wrote, maybe of all of the story together. And I don't know what it was about it. And it ended up being, which I'm not typically this way, but it ended up being a very emotional scene for me to create too. It just, I don't know. I just wouldn't write it. Like I would get to that point in the manuscript and it would be like blocked out, like Garland Dara haircutting scene. And I'd be like, okay,
later,
moving later. I'm going to do that later. And then later was now, and I had to do it. And I'm not sure what it was about that I was avoiding, but it's so funny how that is, because it's not usually anything, at least for me, it's not like major. It's not like it's like the climax scene or anything like that. It's like this, not a one-off, but it is important, obviously, to the story. But this scene, I don't know, I was just walking in circles around it, but then I ended up really loving it. And it's one of my favorite parts. So I guess that's part of it. Just
exactly. Sometimes the hardest parts sometimes the hardest parts to write end up being like the most rewarding parts to write, you know?
Exactly.
So looking back at the book, I know you said like the whole process went really, really fast, but like, were there any moments in particular where your hands were just like flying and you were like looking at your hands, like phantom hands, like who's writing this? Like, how is this just spilling out of me? Like, what were those types of scenes like to write?
I don't think that I think the parts where I'm making myself laugh, I tend to do the fastest.
Okay.
And so there's like a sequence where they're dancing to the hoedown throwdown from the
I was dying. I was cracking up.
Yeah. Those are always the things where I'm having like a lot of fun, because I think when I'm writing it, I'm like, this isn't going to make it into the book. Like, so there's a freedom in my head where I'm like, oh, I'm just like kind of doing this for Bridget right now, getting a little laugh in. And I tend to write those parts probably the fastest, because I think I'm going to talk myself out of it. Then I give myself space and I read it. And then I'm like, well, let's just see,
It's so good.
If my editor says no, I'll get rid of it. But otherwise, I'm going to try.
That scene in particular, though, I was reading it and then I was just like, boom, clap, boom, declap, declap. And I'm like, hey, I have to stop because I can't like focus because I'm literally doing like pop it, lock it, polka dot in the background of my head.
I same, the hawk in the sky.
Exactly. Too good. But now that this book is going to be available for everyone to grab and to read and to totally indulge in and enjoy, like, what are you hoping readers take away from this story? Like, what's your real goal with putting this one out?
I think that my biggest goal definitely with this one is to encourage adults to reconnect to what they loved, or re-explore or explore at all things that maybe they didn't get a chance to do in their youth and they have decided that they can't. And I like, when I'm not writing, I'm a gymnastics coach. So I talk to a lot of adults are always like, I want to learn how to do a flip. I want to learn how to do a cartwheel. I never did that. And they think that they so often assume like they can't anymore because they didn't do it when they were 5. And so, and they can, and they totally can. You can do it at any point. And so that's a big part of what this story, I hope it does for people, is make you go, oh, I always wanted to go to summer camp and I never have. And there are adult summer camps. Like you can go to summer camp and you can be all the things you want. You can be queer even if you didn't realize until you were 35 or whatever it is. Like there's always room for growth. And that 100%. Is the biggest thing I hope people walk away with.
I love that. That's the perfect message. Before I let you go, I have to ask, because everyone's going to want to know, like, what are you working on next? Are you able to share anything coming down the pipeline? I know, like, this is always like the worst question to ask because everyone's like, I want to say, but I can't say. So anything you're comfortable / allowed to share would be very much appreciated. But if we have to wait, then we have to wait.
I do have something coming up, but I can't. I feel like I usually can. And this is a rare instance where I can't. And when the news is out, I think it'll make a little more sense why.
Okay.
But there is more to look forward to, and I'm super excited about it. And it is something slightly different. So that's all I can say at the moment.
Oh no, that's exciting. What an intriguing way to end this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It was such a pleasure getting to know a little bit more about you and your background, and obviously to chat about this book. And I'm so excited for everyone to read it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.